Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. As we're now approaching the end of the year, I'm basically going to be going a little bit into wrap-up mode of all the books I've read over this year, and particularly a few lists, because everyone loves a list, of some of my top books of the year. And I thought I'd start off with this first one here of backlisted books that I've really enjoyed. I will be doing separate videos on my top new releases from this year for both fiction and non-fiction. But I wanted to start off with some of my top reads from the year that have not been released this year. And part of the reason for that is I think those are ones that I always feel a bit weirder putting into my main roundup of the year, just because I think, you know, having, I don't know, Virginia Woolf sitting alongside a book that had just come out that year, it's a bit of a strange mix, and it sometimes means that a book you've, you know, reread or what have you could basically just keep appearing in lists year after year. Anyway, that's a lengthy ramble that nobody needed, and I'm going to go on to talk about the 10 books, my 10 top books from backlisted titles from this year. So let's get started. First up, we have A Ghost in the Throat by Doireann Ghríofa, and this book I just thought was phenomenal in so many ways. It is a book. Oh, hello, Cindy. You just come to join me. You can just see a little. There we go. Hello. You okay, Cindy? What's she doing? Okay. This book I just think is sensational in so many ways. It is partly you know, Ghríofa talking about her own experiences of motherhood, and sort of where she's found that particularly challenging, and these sort of various complications within her own life. But it's also her looking back and talking about sort of as she's writing a biography of a poet, an Irish poet. And so you kind of get this sort of layering of the two narratives almost going on through it, where sometimes you have pages of this Irish poet's work in translation, but you also have the Ghríofa herself talking about her life. And it just really hit me hard. I just thought this is such a stunning and clever book, so profound and beautiful, and just it does so much. So yeah, just a book that's really sort of stuck with me. I think I just found this a really clever and beautiful way of approaching biography, of approaching writing about the craft of writing, and so many other things. And I just think it's phenomenal, really. Next up, this was a year that I finally read some Annie Ernaux, and obviously November happened as well, where I just sort of had a chance to read a bit more of her work as well. But the thing that I found from reading all of her work, I think bar maybe one or two this year, has just been, she's just got such an interesting way of approaching the world and looking at things. And particularly the book The Years, or Exteriors. This was a bit of a toss-up between the two of them for me, because they're probably both my favourites. But in many ways, The Years feels more like a greatest hits of covering so many parts. And I think what's so phenomenal about this book for me is the way that Annie Ernaux is able to bring together so many parts of what's happening in France, what's happening in the world, and thread it through her own personal story as well, and her own personal narrative. I found it just utterly affecting and beautiful. It reads like a novel whilst also not really being one, and I think that's sort of something that feels so uniquely her, is her ability to really weave together these narratives and sort of weave together her diaries with the global picture in a way that just feels so poignant and interesting, and I just absolutely loved it, as you can probably tell. Next up, Foster by Claire Keegan, and obviously with Claire Keegan having been shortlisted for this year's Booker, this has been a good year for her, and Claire Keegan's book Small Things Like These was on my top books of the year last year. I read it just sort of in the last dying weeks of the year and absolutely loved it. And Foster I followed up with soon after, so fairly early this year, and read and loved it. And it was so delightful to see her getting shortlisted for the Booker and getting some extra love and recognition. But I think Foster itself is such a beautifully quiet book, in much the same way as Small Things Like These, telling the story of a foster child trying to navigate their new experience and their new sort of reality. And I think I just found this really quite beautiful and profound. It's just a very short book, I think about 80 pages or so, and it just really gets to the quick. It's a very clever book. I mean, in many ways, this is almost a short story more than a novella, really. and it was, you know, recently turned into a film, and I think it just, her ability to find words for things and to really cut to the quick of what she's trying to get to, I think is really quite profound, and I don't think many people do it quite like Claire Keegan. And this was such a glorious, glorious book to read this year as well. Next up, I read Richard Scott's Soho, a collection of poetry released a few years ago that I just absolutely adored. And I was very, very lucky. I got to go to an event where he was reading some of his poetry and got to get a little signed copy of this as well. I just found this a really beautiful, beautiful collection. In it, he talks a lot about queer identity. He talks a lot about kind of place and belonging. So particularly this idea of Soho in London as this sort of space that's sort of both queer identity and belonging, but also resistance, but also change. And so much happens within these pages. Some really beautiful poems that I found really quite profound and quite affecting. And I mean, this is also a year that I read a lot of Andrew Macmillan, and both of them sort of do similar things to me as a reader, in terms of finding the words for things that I often find quite difficult to really be able to pin down. So I just thought this was such a glorious, glorious book. And yeah, a really nice one for reading a bit more poetry this year as well. Next up, I loved We Are Made of Diamond Stuff by Isabel Waidner. This is a really short book, but it packs so much inside it. It's so clever, it's so fun, and it's incredibly political and broad in the way it approaches things. So a lot of this book is really focused on identity, particularly the notion of European identity and what a passport can and can't do within that. So this sort of book is in some ways preoccupied with a lot of and sort of fascinated by, in many ways, a lot of the conversations around statehood, identity, state violence, immigration, and so many other things. And it does it in this really playful, interesting way. So Isabel Waidner in this book finds ways of exposing the how fragile and shallow our sense of nationhood can be, that actually we often associate it with some very core values or principles, but either we don't notice when those principles have been changed or updated or whatever outside of us, or that we've assumed that we will always keep those rights, and actually we don't then necessarily notice when they're either being taken away or when those rights are being infringed upon for other people. I mean, Isabel Waidner is just such an exciting writer, and this book I loved it. I just thought this was really so clever and interesting. I've thought about it quite a bit since, so I really do urge you to check it out. A nice thing that came out as well from my reading this year was the Eurovision reading challenge I did, which I'm still finishing off the last couple from that. I'm a little bit behind, but that was sort of reading books from the countries that came in the top 10, or top 11 technically, of Eurovision this year. And as a result, I finally got to read a few more Portuguese authors, José Saramago being one of them. And Blindness was a book that many people recommended, and one that I was just really quite blown away by. It's such a dense, dark, and difficult book in many ways. That was unintentional alliteration. And it's so much to contend with. There are almost very few paragraph breaks or anything really on the page. It just is kind of relentless, and his writing style has very few pauses as well. So you often have these sentences that just sprawl out and just go on and on. But actually that really, for me, matches the function of that language in this book, which is describing a really complicated and sort of fantastical world, and a world in which slowly, one by one, people stop being able to see very spontaneously, and it becomes this sort of social contagion in some way, and it, in a very sort of Kafkaesque way, I suppose, immediately starts throwing up these questions of what human values are really like, because some people start getting incredibly violent and start trying to deceive other people. Some people try to care and look after the community. But what does it mean as well if a population, through not being able to see, or in some ways, you know, stopping other parts of how they're able to engage with the world, also therefore sort of shut down political systems, because a political system that's, you know, structured entirely around humans being able to do a certain thing, if they suddenly can't, how do people in power reinforce or keep that power as well? And this is examined a lot in the follow-up book Seeing, which plays a lot with this idea of people in droves turning up and not voting, and voting and leaving it entirely blank, and sort of therefore taking all of the sort of power and agreement for governments out in one fell swoop. So it's really interesting, and I really love how he plays with politics in a very interesting sort of fable almost like way, but in a way that's really quite horrific and quite terrifying. This book lays everything bare, and I think is just really incredible for it as well. So very, very grateful to whoever in the comments suggested that one, because this has been a real highlight of the year for me. Next, while I was going through reading old Goldsmiths Prize winners, I say old, former Goldsmiths Prize winners, I read The Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Eimear McBride, which I just think is phenomenal. It's a difficult book to read in so many ways, and the audiobook I think definitely helped for this. It is a book that describes a really quite traumatic and difficult life of a young woman who is not only caring for a younger brother who is being bullied quite a lot, and she sort of faces some bullying herself sort of by proxy. She's also subjected to sexual harassment and sexual violence and abuse, and this book uses language and breaks language in really clever ways. On the page, it's really quite intimidating as a book, because there'll be full stops in the middle of what would typically otherwise be sentences. There are sometimes words that are entirely broken up, but actually it communicates so much through that, because so much of what this book does that I think is really clever is its ability to find a way of just pushing that little bit further, of actually, if someone is going through intense trauma and they're like 13 or 14 and everything's a bit sort of everything's blowing up in their brain, and they're not really able to keep things straight and kind of focused, this is probably what language would look like for them. And I think this book is so clever for how it manages to capture just what language can look like when it breaks down and can't convey the things it needs to, but actually convey something else very, very different instead. I think this is a masterpiece, and I think it's just such an incredible book. I see why the Goldsmiths Prize and the Women's Prize both championed it, because it's hard going, don't get me wrong. This is not an easy book to read, not only in terms of the physical page, but also just emotionally, but really, really well done, I think. Next up, on a significantly lighter note, we have An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good by Helene Tursten, and translated by Marlaine Delargy. This is a very, very little fun book. Again, one I read as part of the Eurovision challenge, that is just ridiculous. It is a very kind of cozy murder mystery sort of style thing almost, apart from the fact that you realise quite soon on that the woman at the heart of this is doing the murdering. And she is hilarious, and it's very sort of tongue-in-cheek, and it's done in this very kind of polite, clipped, kind of cozy way. It's very weird and very, very fun. Just watching this woman kind of saying like, you know what, I'm old enough. I don't have to suffer fools anymore. I can just commit murder. And you're like, okay, yeah, you do you. That actually sounds quite good. I do not condone murder. But she is just so, it's just so fun, because, all the little quirks that would annoy us in day-to-day life appear in this book, but in these sort of absurd kind of ways. Someone chewing too loudly, someone making too much noise, a neighbor who walks around making too much noise upstairs, all of that kind of stuff all comes out in this woman slowly getting more and more frustrated, to the point where she sort of bursts and does things, but still kind of hides all of it behind this sort of facade of a very sweet old woman who just who couldn't possibly have done any of that. She's perfectly innocent. A very, very fun and wonderfully silly book that I just loved. Next up, we have Percival Everett with Erasure, which I read as part of the sort of a project of looking back at other books by shortlisted Booker authors, and Percival Everett was shortlisted this year for the Trees. Erasure, looking back, is a book that I think was just so good. And I think had he been eligible for the Booker at the time, being an American, I think he probably would have been shortlisted, if not won. I think this book is fantastic. It really, all of the things from the trees where he pokes fun at the sort of the real nuances of race and race relations in the US, particularly, really come to a fore in this book, where he explores this notion that black authors or black creators in any way are only really allowed to be successful if their work seems to tick certain boxes in terms of how it's going to represent the black people within it. So, for example, if there is a slave narrative, if there's a poverty narrative, if there's a sort of an underdog done good kind of narrative, then those works are fine. But if it's sort of, if we're being asked to see these black characters as being just like their white counterparts, no, we're not allowed that. And he pokes fun at this in a really clever way, where 80 pages of this book are given over to a fake novel within a novel. This novel being written as an intentionally satirical work, where characters are named after headache pills. So there's aspirin from aspirin, and there's I can't remember all of them now, like Tylenol, and things like that. And it's really ridiculous and silly, but actually it pokes fun at all of that, because this book then goes on to be wildly popular, and white readers and reviewers are talking constantly about how innovative and clever this book is and how it's game-changing, and he wrote it all as a joke. And so it's just a really clever and fun book, and I just think it feels just so playful and piercing and clever, and I loved it. I think it's just such a clever book. And last but not least, In the Dream House by Carmen Marie Machado. And this book is not an easy read. It's fair to say. It's a really deeply layered book. It's a book that talks a lot about domestic violence, and it does so in, I think, some really interesting and clever ways. She essentially tells her story of having been in this abusive relationship, and she tells it through tropes or genres from across literature and film and TV. So, for example, it will be the dream house that she talks about, the dream house as sci-fi fantasy, the dream house as choose your own adventure. And that's the section that I think is particularly effective in this whole book, which is the whole thing done as a direct to you of, what's your choice? If you choose to do this, turn to this page. And this is where the book gets incredibly meta, where it will say, if you would tell this woman to shove it and, leave this relationship, go to this page. And if you go to that page, it says, no, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't have the power or the strength or the confidence to do that. Go to this page instead. And if you try and read it in a linear fashion, and you just go through the pages normally in that section, it will say things like, why are you trying to read this like a traditional linear story? There was no linear narrative to this. There's no easy, happy ending. And it spooked me as a reader, because not only being so directly addressed by the writer, but a writer really sort of at the height of her powers, going through and knowing what you're going to do next and knowing how you might approach it, and actually teaching you something within that about narratives around domestic abuse are so complicated, and the narratives we often get look a certain way, but actually here's me showing you something different, particularly as her relationship was with another woman. And so she talks a lot in the book about how that's a narrative that we also don't often see. A really, really incredible book, really inventive and just heartbreaking. And I don't know how on earth she wrote it. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So anyway, if these haven't been dark enough as a set of books, I realise very few of these seem like laugh out loud kind of ones, with the exception of An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good, which is just about murder. So clearly my reading tastes are not the happiest thing, it seems. But it's been such a wonderful reading year. These have been such great books. And very soon I'll have videos where I am talking about my top fiction and non-fiction books from this year, as in books released this year or very late last year. And I'm really excited to talk about all of those as well. I've been Bob the Bookerer. I hope you've enjoyed this video and these books. And it's been a pleasure being with you across a camera and screen throughout the year. So thank you all so much, and take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.